Hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. If you didn't know, this season I am narrating for you Queen Andraya. Thank you for coming back to join me again. I hope you all had a wonderful Memorial Day, and that you had the day off. Speaking of days off, I will be on vacation next week, which is wonderful. The only downside is that I will not be able to bring you another episode. And I'm so sorry about that. But at least it's better than having to wait 2 years for the next book, right? And also, I will have another chapter ready for you in 2 weeks when I get back. Anyway, without further ado, today we are on Chapter 18. Here we go. Chapter 18. Suspects. Queen Andraya stared at the 10-foot painting of the late king and herself in the palace entryway. How ridiculous to have a painting so large. That was Gordon's idea, of course. The extravagant gold dress she wore was also his idea. The skirt fanned out in front of her, making an upside-down rainbow, revealing its tiny, intricate designs of roses along the hem. Andraya shivered. Roses. She recalled how she had told Gordon she would prefer to wear silver, because it looked better with her light skin and black hair. His response was only, "Silver is not fit for a queen. You will wear gold." A surge of anger rushed its way up from her stomach to her throat. "What is it that you do not like about this painting?" said a low voice in her ear. Andraya jumped in place and spun around. "Prince Steffan! How dare you sneak up on me like that?" "I apologize," he said, his lips twitching. His eyes smiled so brightly that Andraya knew he was stifling a laugh as well. "This is the painting you wish to replace, is it not?" he asked. "Yes," said the queen, twisting around to examine it again. Steffan stepped forward to stand beside her. "I cannot fathom why. I think it is magnificent. I especially love your smile. It is not quite full, but not subtle either." Then he turned his head to look at her. "How do you do that?" Andraya returned his gaze. He was beaming at her again. How did he do that? She managed a smile. "There you go again," he said. "How do you do it?" His eyes lingered on her lips. Andraya's heart leaped. She quickly turned back to the painting. A brief silence followed before Steffan said, "The artist had quite the skilled hand. It is a true likeness of you. Of course, I never met the late king, but I assume it is of him as well." The queen glared at King Gordon's painted face. He sat on his throne, noticeably higher than hers. He wore a fine gold robe over his large shoulders and protruding belly, along with his gold tunic, which the queen hated now as much as she did then. His face held a solemn expression, and his brown eyes shone with his usual animosity. But what she hated the most was his hand on her shoulder, appearing as if he were affectionate, which was nothing less than blatant hypocrisy on his part. "Indeed it is," Andraya finally said to the prince. "So why is it you want it replaced?" Andraya had no idea how to answer that. "Is it the roses on your dress, since you despise the flower?" Andraya twisted to look at his expression. He lifted one eyebrow. "Why is that, by the way?" Andraya huffed out a small breath and forced a smile. "It is my little secret, Your Highness." Steffan chuckled in his deep voice. "What about that gorgeous spot of land you have, where dozens and dozens of rose bushes are thriving? Do you despise all of those roses?" "Very much, sir." Steffan smiled at her with both amusement and curiosity. "Mystery never fails you, does it?" Andraya opened her arms in resignation. "Being a queen comes with enchantment." Steffan laughed. "It certainly does." Just then, Benjamin appeared by her side, with one proper hand behind his back and the other holding a large tray of salted crackers and various cubed cheeses. "Here you are, Your Majesty." "Oh, thank you, Benjamin, but I did not ask for these." "His Highness requested that I have them brought to you," Benjamin explained. "He did he?" Andraya asked, cocking her head at the prince. "Of course," Steffan said. "You need to make up for all that time you could not eat. Besides, you will need energy for our horse ride." "Our horse ride?" she said with raised eyebrows. "Absolutely," said the prince, as if this shared activity was highly regular. Andraya lifted her chin and eyed him with suspicion. Then Steffan's pretense faltered. "If you would like to," he said softly. Andraya grinned. "I would love to." Steffan beamed, as if this were the greatest gift she had ever given him. Benjamin lifted his hand to cover a cough. After the queen and the prince gobbled down a sufficient quantity of crackers and cheese, Andraya hooked her elbow with his, while the doorman heaved open the tall double doors of the palace entrance. The doorman bowed and closed the doors behind them. "Chestnut is already here," Andraya exclaimed. She smiled down at the shiny brown stallion, who stood at the bottom of the many descending stone steps, with the stable hand standing by holding his reins. "Yes, and the stable master allowed me to borrow that sturdy mare." Steffan pointed to a solid black horse beside Chestnut, with Jace standing by. "Oh, that is Midnight. Do you like her?" the queen asked, glancing at Steffan. "Yes, of course. She is beautiful," Steffan exclaimed with a smile. "Then she is yours." Steffan's eyes doubled in size. "What? No, I could not possibly." "But she has no one to claim her. She is yours now." "Jace, I am giving Midnight to Prince Steffan," Andraya called down to the stable master. Jace bowed in response. "There, you see, it is all settled," Andraya said, beaming up at the prince. Steffan's smile had never been so bright. Then, without notice, the prince lifted her high in the air and spun her around. Andraya laughed with the sensation. Then he brought her back to her feet and held her close to him. "Thank you," he whispered. Andraya leaned her head against his shoulder. A man was holding her with tenderness, and it was not Besnik or her father. She wished she could explain to the prince how he deserved much more than a horse. Suddenly, Steffan swept the queen into his arms and jogged down the many steps, and lifted Andraya on top of Chestnut's sturdy back, so that she sat sideways in the saddle. "There you are, my lady," he whispered. "Once again, Your Highness," Andraya said, reverting back to formalities. "I am not in riding attire." Steffan grinned. "That has not stopped you before." Andraya blushed at that. Steffan fought back a smile as he gave her leg a sympathetic squeeze. "We will just go for a gentle ride." He walked over to Midnight and jumped on her back. The stableman handed him the reins. "Thank you kindly. Lead the way, Your Majesty." Andraya clicked her heels against Chestnut's side, and he clipped along the cobblestone's meandering paths until they reached the cemetery. "Are we visiting someone's grave?" Steffan called from behind her. No, Andraya called back. She only visited Gordon's grave when she was angry, and the day proved much too fine for that. The queen led Steffan and his horse all the way through the cemetery until they reached the forest. She slowed Chestnut's steps, and they sauntered through moist dirt among clusters of thick, wet trees. "I do not believe I have seen so much green in one place before," Steffan said, looking up and around at the scene. "Come this way. I want to show you something even more remarkable." Andraya led Chestnut deeper into the forest and up a slight incline where the land was a bit drier. She stopped at a small little tree that looked like it was struggling to live, but persevering. She jumped off Chestnut and crouched beside the tree. "I knew it," she whispered. "What is it?" Steffan asked, jumping off his horse and coming to crouch beside the queen. "It's tamarind." Andraya plucked off the fruit and handed it to the prince. Steffan held it up to examine the fruit that looked like a pea pod, but with fibrous pulp as a skin. Incredible! How does it grow in this climate? I do not know, Andraya admitted, but every time I come here it has fruit for me. Steffan twirled it around to examine it from all angles. Well, if I were a tiny tree, I would do anything to keep a gorgeous, intelligent, compassionate, capable, fiery woman coming back to me. Andraya laughed. What if you were a prince? Steffan flashed her a smile. That too. Just then, a tiny spider crawled its way over Steffan's shoulder. Andraya flicked it off. Oh, thank you. How refreshing that you are not frightened by spiders. Well, I am about 1,000,000 times bigger than one. Steffan laughed. My thoughts exactly. He motioned toward a large rock, and Andraya moved to sit on it, while the prince tied up their horses. I have never met a royal like you, Prince Steffan. Nor I you, Queen Andraya. His eyes bore into hers. Andraya smiled shyly. May I tell you something? Steffan nodded as he came to sit on a rock next to her. Anything, he said, with the same penetrating stare. Andraya hesitated. I am actually scared of spiders. Steffan laughed out loud. She chortled along with him a moment, then said, I never have been, until recently. Steffan grew instantly solemn and frowned in sympathy. He slowly grabbed her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. There it was again, a tender touch. Her heart danced with nervousness and excitement. Andraya's first inclination was to pull away, but she did not. Have you traveled to the kingdom of Sandrian? She asked. Steffan nodded. Do you know what their venomous spiders look like? Yes. Have you seen any here? Steffan shook his head. They are huge. You would know if you saw one. Andraya shivered. Tell me about Sandrian. Steffan shifted into that familiar pose he had on the beach, with his knees up and his forearms resting on them. Well, as you know, the kingdom's main resource is gold, and one would think that would make their kingdom a lot wealthier than it is. But King Zokai is a very greedy man. His people were very upset when he commissioned a solid gold statue of himself. Andraya gasped. He did not. Oh, that's not the half of it. He has gold statues all over his grounds, not to mention the gold dishes he eats on while he sits on his solid gold throne. Oh my, said the queen. In other words, he does not leave much for his people. Exactly, Steffan said. What are the royals like? Do they behave like my council? Steffan smiled sadly. No, but they are more pompous. King Zokai, however, is quite abrasive. In fact, the only person I remember him speaking well of is your late husband. Andraya cringed. I cannot help but think that the person who poisoned me must be linked to Sandrian somehow. Steffan shifted so that he was angled toward her. That makes sense, since the poison came from Sandrian spider venom. Do you think it could be the ambassador of Sandrian? He is the only one here from that kingdom. Steffan nodded slowly. He certainly could have smuggled in one of those spider beasts. Or the Chancellor of Customs could have instructed his workers to not inspect the imports as he should, the queen suggested. Steffan sighed as he pinched the brim of his nose and closed his eyes. I dislike the Chancellor very much. Andraya chuckled. I noticed. I am sorry I lost my temper with him earlier, Steffan said, with his eyes still closed. Andraya laughed. It is nearly impossible not to. Believe me, I would know. Steffan peeked at her now. Are you interested in him? What? Andraya cried. Steffan put down his arm and faced her more directly. Are you interested in him? Andraya's jaw dropped. Seeing that I just considered him involved in my own attempted murder, I believe I will have to give you an unequivocal no. Steffan smiled a little sheepish. He grabbed her hand again and squeezed it. All right. May I ask what you two discussed in your office after I left? Andraya huffed out a breath. Nothing that man says is worth repeating. Steffan tilted his head to look at the sky. He smoothed her hand with slow, gentle strokes. All right. Maybe the ambassador and the chancellor are working together, Andraya suggested. Steffan grew thoughtful. Perhaps. They do appear to be friends. He looked back to Andraya. Have you noticed how peculiar the ambassador's accent is? Andraya shrugged. I assume it is a Sandrian accent. Indeed it is, Steffan confirmed, stroking her hand some more. But it does not sound royal-born. Sometimes I do not believe he is who he says he is. Who do you think he really is? Andraya asked. Steffan shook his head in bewilderment. I do not know, but he does spend an awful lot of time with the Duke of Gulen. A shiver raced up the Queen's spine. He could be involved too. He is a known slave owner, and I am a known abolitionist. Steffan nodded. An abolitionist with power. Do you know the reason I came to Chaldrea? The Queen shrugged. To join the island coalition, I assume. Steffan nodded. I came to convince them to stop trading with the slave-owning kingdom. I thought I was going to have to convince King Gordon. But of course he passed when I was en route. And you would not believe my relief when at the first meeting I learned that Chaldrea's new leader agreed with me. Andraya smiled. You must be the one who convinced Deldrea to join the coalition, are you not? Steffan gave her a small smile and nodded. Just then, a nearby bush rustled with movement. They stopped and looked to their right. Andraya squinted through the deep green leaves. Is someone there? No answer. Hello? Who is there? Suddenly, the hidden person bolted. Andraya could not make out who it was, but he disrupted the branches and bushes at a speedy rate toward the south side of the forest. Ho there! Steffan called. But the figure kept going, and soon Andraya could no longer see a branch or bush disrupted. She turned to look at the prince. His frantic face must have been a mirror of hers. My queen, I am afraid we have been followed. And that concludes Chapter 18. I apologize for the cliffhanger. I hope you will come back in 2 weeks to hear more of Queen Andraya. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.